Annapolis, Maryland, May 1945. Dr. Robert Goddard stood motionless in the Naval Laboratory warehouse, staring at the object before him. The ailing physicist, his voice already reduced to a hoarse whisper by the throat cancer that would claim him within months, ran his fingers along the cold aluminum skin of the German V-2 rocket. For 20 years, he had been America's lone voice in the wilderness of rocketry, building liquid-fueled rockets on shoestring budgets, while the government ignored his pleas for support. Now in this dimly lit warehouse, surrounded by Army ordnance officers and Navy engineers, Goddard confronted a truth that would haunt American rocket science for the next decade. The rocket towering over him was not crude, not experimental, not theoretical. It was finished, operational, battle-tested. A weapon from a future no Allied scientist had truly believed existed. Its guidance fins were machined to a perfection only German wartime industry seemed capable of. Its turbopumps were decades ahead of the improvisational prototypes built in American garages. Its fuel system hinted at sustained, controlled thrust. Not seconds, but minutes of powered flight. And its range? 200 miles. A bomb that could cross borders vertically. Beyond radar. Beyond interception. Beyond warning. What stood before Goddard was not just a missile. It was proof that Hitler's engineers had touched the threshold of space, while the Allies were still arguing whether rockets were practical science. Behind him, a young Navy lieutenant whispered, almost in disbelief, "They built this in the middle of a war?" Goddard swallowed painfully. "No," he rasped. "They built this while losing one." He knew, with chilling clarity, that America had not just captured a weapon. It had captured a warning from the future. The story of how this machine arrived in an American warehouse did not begin with engineers or laboratories, but with confusion, disbelief, and a terrifying puzzle unfolding across Europe long before Goddard ever touched its surface. In 1943, Allied intelligence had begun intercepting German communications referring to a Vergeltungswaffe, a vengeance weapon. At first, British analysts assumed another aerial terror campaign was coming, perhaps a heavier version of the V-1 buzz bomb, but what they could not reconcile were the field reports that followed. Whole neighborhoods in London collapsing without the sound of incoming engines, without sirens, without aircraft, without warning. The first V-2s hit like thunder falling straight from the sky. Witnesses described the explosions as instantaneous, arriving before any sound. There was no interception because there was nothing to intercept. By the time soldiers heard anything, the rocket had already impacted and detonated. Churchill was briefed that Germany had achieved supersonic velocity, a phrase that sounded like science fiction in 1944. Some of his advisors didn't believe it was even physically possible. But within the German war machine, this was no rumor. Inside secret research complexes like Peenemünde, Hitler's scientists, under the direction of Werner von Braun and General Dornberger, were building something the Allies had no parallel for. The world's first long-range ballistic missile. And worse, it worked. Meanwhile, the Allies were left blind. Radar gave no warning. Pilots searching for rocket sites saw nothing like a conventional airfield. These launchers could be erected in forests, on flat roads, even in farms disguised under canvas camouflage nets. The V-2 could be fired and gone again before a recon aircraft could even bank for a second pass. British intelligence analysts initially dismissed the early reports as exaggeration. Surely no nation fighting on two collapsing fronts could have advanced rocketry beyond laboratory curiosity. How could a country starving for fuel build engines more complex than anything the U.S. Navy Experimental Bureau had ever attempted? But then came fragments, intercepted pieces of wreckage retrieved from London blast sites. Metal alloys no Allied foundry could duplicate. Guidance components of unnervingly high precision. Gyroscopic stabilizers that seemed tailored for flight beyond the atmosphere, not merely across a channel. This was not a terror weapon built in desperation. It was a prototype from an entirely different era of engineering. Quietly, British intelligence began to panic. Military analysts feared the unspoken implication. If Germany could launch an unmanned rocket across the channel, what stopped them from building one large enough to cross oceans? A single bomb landing on New York or Washington, without a plane ever leaving German soil, was not impossible anymore. Just improbable. And in war, improbable was dangerously close to eventual. The entire Allied command structure now understood. This wasn't simply a weapon of destruction. It was psychological warfare of the highest order. It meant the enemy was playing on a battleground of time, borrowing technology from the future to influence the present. By late 1944, Churchill authorized what would become the most secretive weapons intelligence effort of the entire war, an operation to capture not debris, but an entire V-2 intact, not for propaganda, not for display, but to understand what Germany had built and how far ahead they might truly be. The race was no longer to defeat Hitler's armies. It was to prevent the future from arriving in German hands first. The first time American engineers disassembled a V-2 engine in New Mexico, a stunned silence fell over the hangar. Thick steel that looked rough and almost crude from the outside concealed. A level of internal precision the Allies had never imagined Germany capable of maintaining while its cities lay in ruins. The combustion chamber alone was a revelation. Regenerative cooling channels carved with terrifying elegance, allowing the rocket to burn alcohol and liquid oxygen at temperatures hot enough to melt steel, yet remain intact for the entire flight. The Americans had no equivalent, not even on the drawing board. Colonel Holger Toftoy, who had been ordered to gather whatever German science could be salvaged before the Soviets reached it, realized in that moment that they hadn't just captured a weapon. They had captured an entire future, one the United States almost failed to notice until it was nearly too late. The V-2 wasn't built like a bomb. It was built like the first machine designed for space. Inside its guidance compartment, gyroscopes spun inside frictionless gimbals with a stability unheard of in any Allied weapon. American scientists didn't just marvel at it, they winced at it, because this was the kind of technology U.S. research agencies had laughed at Goddard for requesting funds to develop back in the 1930s. Now the Germans had not only built it, they had mass-produced it. Even the wiring harnesses were built with obsessive intentionality. Color-coded, numbered, bundled, and aerodynamic patterns, not to save space, but to minimize vibration resonance during supersonic travel. Most American aircraft didn't even have vibration-tuned wiring, let alone weapons. The engineers tore deeper into the rocket. Then came the moment that shook them the hardest. Captured V-2 technician casually explained that they had a telemetry system that transmitted in-flight diagnostics in real time. The Americans stared at him, confused. Radio from a rocket? Measuring altitude, chamber pressure, engine efficiency, mid-flight? The U.S. didn't even have a working battlefield system capable of that. But the most disturbing revelation wasn't physical. It was philosophical. The V-2 wasn't built as a desperation weapon. It was built as a prototype. The German scientists were already designing engines twice as powerful, with higher ISP, thinner walls, and experimental staging capability. Decades ahead in thinking. The V-2 was just their proof of concept. Werner von Braun had never intended it to be the end. It was supposed to be the first step toward the edge of Earth. When American intelligence officers realized this, the tone of their mission changed overnight. This was no longer about denying Germany a weapon. This was about denying the Soviets a future. Toftoy knew one thing with chilling clarity. If Stalin got to these engineers first, Moscow would reach orbit long before Washington ever did. Meanwhile, copies of German schematics were already being rushed to Washington under sealed security orders. Strictly eyes only. National strategic priority. The words stamped across the envelopes were a polite translation of what generals were whispering in closed rooms. If we don't master this, the next war won't be fought on Earth. In that New Mexico hangar, staring into a machine that shouldn't have existed yet, American engineers realized something almost humiliating. The Axis had been losing the war on the ground, but they had been winning the war of tomorrow, and the V-2 was only the beginning. The deeper U.S. intelligence dug into Germany's rocket program, the clearer one unsettling pattern became. This wasn't improvisation born from wartime panic. This was infrastructure, a foundation for an entire technological era the Allies didn't even know they were behind in. When Allied investigators reached Nordhausen and Peenemünde, they weren't walking into a weapons factory. They were walking into an industry of tomorrow. Entire underground research wings had been dedicated not to battlefield deployment, but to theoretical propulsion, high-altitude stabilization, staged boosters, turbopump miniaturization, and most shocking of all, atmospheric exit trajectories. The Germans weren't just trying to hit London, they were trying to leave Earth's grip. One Army Air Forces engineer wrote in his classified report, "These men are not artillery designers. They are astronomers building artillery as a stepping stone." Inside a Peenemünde filing room that somehow survived RAF bombings, U.S. investigators found early sketches of multi-stage rockets, something American research circles still debated as theoretical. The designs were already functional on paper: a booster stage for atmospheric exit, a sustainer stage for upper trajectory, and a guidance phase that anticipated gravitational drop-off. In 1944, America didn't have a single engineering institution capable of calculating those equations at scale, and Germany had been doing it for years. But what truly rattled U.S. intelligence wasn't simply what the Germans had already built. It was what they were planning next. They uncovered blueprints labeled A9-A10, a rocket far larger than the V-2, designed with a curved long-range trajectory capable of crossing the Atlantic. It wasn't theoretical propaganda. The calcs were real. The thrust ratios were real. The engine scaling was real. This wasn't a revenge weapon. It was a prototype for intercontinental delivery systems. The first ICBM in 1944. If the war had lasted even one more year, New York might have faced something the modern world had never seen. A city struck without warning from another continent by a supersonic rocket that no aircraft could intercept. That was the moment U.S. command realized what the V-2 truly represented. Not a terror weapon, a doorway. A doorway to a world where geography no longer protected oceans. A world where borders meant nothing to velocity. A world where whoever controlled space controlled the Earth beneath it. When U.S. ordnance officers showed the A9-A10 files to top brass in Washington, the response was not disbelief. It was urgency. These weren't dreamers doodling madness. They were engineers on the edge of a breakthrough the United States hadn't even started reaching toward. And there was something else, a discovery far more politically explosive. The German rocket division wasn't some side project hidden beneath the military hierarchy. It was the hierarchy. Peenemünde scientists had direct access to Hitler, access bypassing generals and conventional branches of the Wehrmacht. They had their own supply lines, their own classified research zones, and an SS-backed corridor of protection more powerful than some entire army divisions. They weren't weapons manufacturers. They were a state within a state. If Hitler had won another 12 to 18 months of industrial breathing room, the battlefield wouldn't have been London. It would have been orbit. The Allies had defeated the Reich's tanks, its air wings, its infantry, but they had almost been defeated by its future. And now, standing among captured hardware, seized research logs, and terrified German engineers awaiting interrogation, the Americans faced a question no military officer had ever had to answer before. This wasn't about who won the war. It was about who would own what came after war, and the race for that future had just begun. The first interrogations of captured German rocket personnel began in late May 1945, and from the very first session it was obvious the United States was not talking to ordinary enemy technicians. These were not uniformed men accustomed to chain-of-command discipline. These were mathematicians, aerodynamicists, guidance theorists, civilians drafted into a war machine, then elevated above the military system that contained them. The Americans expected fear. What they got was confidence. Many of the Peenemünde scientists spoke not like defeated prisoners, but like professionals interviewing their future employers. They knew exactly how valuable they were, not just to the U.S., but to the Soviets as well. And the scientists understood something that Washington had barely begun to grasp. The V-2 was not a finished weapon. It was a prototype platform, step one of a long staircase, and they weren't planning to stop climbing. Major Staver's early reports summed up the tone of the interrogations in one chilling line. These men do not behave as though their work is over, only interrupted. The more the Americans asked questions, the more they realized they weren't dealing with a single program, but a research culture, a collection of interconnected engineering branches that had been building a framework for an entirely new era of warfare. But the true shock came when translators began reviewing the research notebooks confiscated from senior project members. Page after page of hand-drawn calculations, experimental trajectories, combustion stress tolerances, all annotated not for battlefield use, but for scalability. The V-2 wasn't designed as the ultimate rocket. It was designed as the first one that could be tested in combat. Proof of concept. On a national budget. And then came the moment that changed everything. A Peenemünde technician, frightened, shivering in an interrogation room, mentioned offhand that German leadership already had plans for orbital reconnaissance platforms after the A9-A10 came online. Not propaganda. Engineering files. Calculations for exo-atmospheric stabilization using spin tanks and gyroscopic drift correction. In 1945, before jet airliners, before America even had a true rocketry bureau, Germany was sketching the outlines of space infrastructure. the United States suddenly understood the stakes. This wasn't just a captured weapon. This was a stolen future. The tone of the operation shifted overnight. What had begun as a post-war intelligence assessment turned into the opening move of the space race, months before the world even knew such a race existed. The question was no longer, what did Germany build? The question became, who gets the men who built it? And that is where the shadow politics began. The quiet deals, the erased pasts, the sealed files, the relocation flights that moved under the cover of night. Because when Washington realized how easily the Soviets could seize the same scientists and vault ahead, the United States made a decision it would later spend decades denying. War crimes were suddenly negotiable. But rocket science was not. The race for space had begun, but it would not be fought with missiles alone. It would be fought with minds. The scientists were valuable. But the Americans still didn't fully grasp just how valuable until they began tracing the personnel files behind the program's leadership. That's when one name began to surface more frequently than any other, Wernher von Braun. Not as a footnote, not as a subordinate, but as the architect. To U.S. analysts, this was the most disturbing revelation of all. The V-2 wasn't the result of a military genius or a government committee. It was the brainchild of a 32-year-old aristocratic engineer who had begun dreaming of leaving Earth before he was old enough to vote. Von Braun didn't think like a soldier. He thought like a colonist. In the interrogation notes, he spoke more about destinations than targets, about altitude thresholds more than detonation yields. To him, London wasn't the victory. London was the test stand. The battlefield was merely the scaffolding for a larger idea. An idea the United States was suddenly terrified to admit was far beyond anything in its own laboratories. The Americans quickly noticed something else. The German rocket program hadn't just been protected. It had been prioritized. Across the ruins of the Reich, U.S. intelligence documented a disturbing resource pattern. When the army lacked steel, Peenemünde still got shipments. When aviation fuel was rationed, rocket fuel was safeguarded. When entire divisions froze in the east, the experimental thrust tunnels continued receiving power. This wasn't some desperate gamble in the final year of the war. The Reich had bet early on rockets as the weapon that would secure not just victory, but strategic supremacy for the next century. And this forced the U.S. into its most uncomfortable realization yet. They had not won the future. They had simply arrived early enough to confiscate it. Now the clock was ticking. Because just across the ruins of Berlin, the Soviets were closing in on the same scientists, the same blueprints, the same prototypes, but without Washington's moral hesitation. Stalin didn't care how many slave laborers died digging the tunnels at Mittelwerk. He didn't care what deals needed to be made. He only cared about acceleration. For the first time in modern history, the balance of global power was not going to be determined by armies, fleets, or diplomacy, but by who could reach higher first. Washington now faced a decision with no precedent. Do they treat these men like prisoners of war? Or like recruits? The answer formed slowly at first, in whispers, in classified cables, in closed-door War Department meetings. But by the summer of 1945, it had crystallized into doctrine. Capture the scientists and bury their pasts. The V-2 wasn't just a weapon. It was leverage, and men like von Braun, they weren't going to be interrogated much longer. They were going to be absorbed. An internal army memo from June 1945, declassified decades later, contained a sentence that defined the next 50 years of geopolitics. Possession of the personnel is equivalent to possession of the technology. If the United States lost the scientists, it lost the next war before it even began. What began as intelligence gathering was transforming into something else entirely. A recruitment pipeline disguised as debriefing. The Americans were no longer simply asking questions. They were shopping. Behind the polite interrogation rooms and technical inventories, something had started, quietly. Off the record, the United States was not just collecting weapons. It was collecting the future caretakers of space. And soon, the German scientists were going to make a choice, not between guilt and innocence, but between which superpower would inherit their dreams. By late summer 1945, the race was no longer theoretical. It was physical. Trainloads of seized documentation were already being transported west, while Soviet special units swept through eastern Germany, seizing everything that wasn't welded down. Both sides were no longer interested in the V-2 itself. They wanted the system behind it. The guidance mathematics, the fuel chemistry, the combustion chamber alloys, the turbopump tolerances, the launch logistics, the correction algorithms, the intellectual DNA of the rocket. But Washington still had one problem. Blueprints could be copied. Hardware could be seized, but knowledge lived inside people, and those people were now effectively free agents, trapped between collapse on one side and opportunity on the other. It was here that the U.S. began tightening its strategy. What had begun as Operation Overcast would soon evolve into something far more covert, something the world would one day know as Operation Paperclip, the silent extraction and disappearance of hundreds of German rocket scientists, engineers, aerodynamicists, metallurgists, and guidance specialists into U.S. custody. The Soviets were doing the same, but where Moscow used force, Washington used incentive. To the Americans' surprise, many of the scientists, including von Braun's core team, weren't afraid of being interrogated. They were afraid of being irrelevant. These were men who had spent a decade staring past the war, toward a technological horizon measured not in miles, but in orbit. The Nazi project might have collapsed, but their dreams had not, and the United States was quickly realizing how to exploit that ambition. Meanwhile, something extraordinary was happening behind the scenes. American military intelligence officers were no longer writing technical reports. They were writing character assessments. Not what can this man build, but how easily can he be politically erased and repurposed. Goddard had been the prophet no one listened to. Von Braun had been the prodigy the world didn't see coming. Now the U.S. wanted both legacies, the dream of the visionary and the capability of the architect. But they weren't the only ones moving quickly. In September, Soviet officers made a brutal play at Bleicherode, detaining entire German technical families and forcibly relocating them eastward. They didn't ask for cooperation. They claimed ownership. Washington now understood that this wasn't a recovery mission anymore. It was a talent war. The final turning point came when von Braun and his senior staff, fearing Soviet capture, signaled their willingness to surrender, not to Allied command, but specifically to the Americans. Not because they feared trial, not because they regretted what they built, but because they believed the United States, not Russia, could still take them to space. And this realization forced the U.S. government to confront a question it had avoided since Peenemünde fell. If these men were absorbed into American industry, what would that make the United States? A victor? Or an inheritor of the same machine, just under a different flag? The intelligence officers never discussed that question on paper. It lived only in the silence between memos, but the momentum could no longer be stopped. The wheels were already turning. The transfer lists were forming. The legal whitewashing had begun. The United States had crossed a moral threshold, long before it admitted it had even stepped forward, and soon, the German scientists would no longer be captured personnel. They would become something new altogether. Americans. By October 1945, the story of the V-2 was no longer unfolding on German soil. It was unfolding on U.S. airfields under military escort, inside sealed hangars, behind classified designations that did not yet officially exist. Entire rail shipments of hardware had vanished from the European theater, appearing weeks later on American docks under falsified manifests reading technical equipment, experimental, crates containing combustion chambers, launch sequencing valves, guidance gyroscopes, and shattered but salvageable fuselage sections were unloaded under armed guard at Aberdeen, White Sands, and Fort Bliss. To the public, the war was over. To the U.S. Army, the real war had just begun. What arrived in America was more than scrap. It was a blueprint of tomorrow, and it came with something even more valuable. The people who knew how to breathe life back into it. The first V-2 reassembly tests in the United States revealed just how far behind American rocketry truly was. U.S. engineers struggled to interpret even the standard maintenance documents. The tolerances were unlike anything used in U.S. munitions. The metallurgy was unfamiliar. The turbopump functioned on principles most American propulsion schools hadn't even taught yet. Guidance? That was completely alien. A self-contained inertial stabilization architecture decades ahead of U.S. fire control computation. The Americans hadn't just captured a machine. They had captured a time gap, and bridging that gap would require the very men who created it. It was during these first assembly attempts, when U.S. specialists realized they couldn't even fuel the rocket safely without consulting German personnel, that the government's internal hesitation evaporated. This wasn't a case of if Paperclip would go forward. It was now only a question of how fast. The ethical argument was quietly swept off the table. Every delay was a gift to Moscow. When the first successful U.S.-based V-2 static test fired in New Mexico, the shock wasn't in the sound. It was in the silence afterward. Officers and observers stood stunned. They were no longer looking at a weapon from the past. They were looking at the birth certificate of the future. Suddenly, every agency that had ignored Goddard, dismissed long-range rocketry, or mocked star scientists wanted in. Budgets were unlocked. Research bureaus were created. Authority shifted overnight from the generals of the present to the engineers of the next century. Inside secured conference rooms, U.S. command reached a chilling but unmistakable conclusion. Germany had not been losing the war because its technology failed. Germany had been losing because time ran out before the technology could reshape the battlefield, and the United States would not make that same mistake. The public saw the victory parade. The Pentagon saw the shadow of a missed future. Washington had come to Europe expecting to catalog spoils of war. Instead, it had stumbled into an unfinished relay handoff, and realized the baton was not a bomb at all, but the foundation of the space age. Now the priority was no longer seizure, it was integration, no longer evidence collection, but replication. The German scientists would not merely be questioned, they would be absorbed into America's technological bloodstream, and the V-2 would become more than a captured weapon. It would become a prototype for empire. The US wasn't adopting German rocketry. It was about to inherit the role Germany had built for itself, the first true power on Earth whose battlefield would one day be the sky above it. By early 1946, America was no longer simply hosting German rocket scientists. It was rebuilding their ecosystem. Fort Bliss became their temporary command post, White Sands their proving ground, and over time, an invisible line was crossed. They were no longer captured personnel. They were staff. But there was a problem Washington could not ignore, one that had nothing to do with engineering, combustion physics, or guidance instrumentation. America couldn't admit any of this. To bring these men into the country, the U.S. government had scrubbed dossiers, erased SS affiliations, relabeled war crimes as technical necessity, and rewritten paper trails to make them appear like ordinary specialists brought over for industrial consultation. That was the paperclip itself, the literal paperclip attached to falsified personnel files before they were submitted for approval. Officially, von Braun had never directed slave labor. Officially, Peenemünde had never operated as a death-through engineering complex. Officially, Mittelwerk, where thousands of prisoners died digging the tunnels that forged the future, became merely a subterranean production site. The United States didn't just import scientists, it imported amnesia. And with that, amnesia came a paradox that shaped the next century of American power. To build the rockets of tomorrow, the government had to bury the memory of how those rockets had been born. Inside the War Department, a new doctrine began to form, not written in public policy, but in classified culture. Technological superiority justified moral compromise. If the Soviets got the engineers first, America would lose not a battlefield, but history itself, because whichever nation weaponized the future would inherit not just strategic advantage, but technological leadership so overwhelming it could redefine world order. That wasn't theory anymore, it was math. A rocket that could strike London today could reach orbit tomorrow and dictate the balance of power forever. In that light, morality became a luxury no superpower could afford. So Washington sealed the files. The scientists were given American jobs, American security clearances, and eventually American citizenship. But something else happened during this transition. Something subtle, yet world-shaping. The U.S. didn't just hire these men. It adopted their horizon. Before the V-2, American rocketry was parochial, a technical curiosity, a laboratory exercise. After the V-2, rocketry became strategic destiny. The vocabulary shifted from war asset to launch capability, from payload to mission, from weaponization to ascent. The very language of American power began to tilt upward. But behind that ascent lived a contradiction so deep that the government would spend decades burying it. The space age was not born in triumph. It was born in salvage. The United States didn't invent its rocket program. It inherited one already decades in motion. And no matter how carefully political speeches would later polish the narrative, the truth remained. America did not leap ahead of the world after 1945. It boarded a moving train. One Germany had already put on the tracks. One that could not, stop now. By the time the public would eventually learn what Operation Paperclip truly was, it would be too late to undo. The rockets would already be flying. The scientists would already be citizens. The infrastructure would already be American. The future was no longer something to win. The future had already been claimed, and the only question left was, who would carry it upward first? By the time the first American-assembled V-2 arced into the New Mexico sky in 1946, the symbolism was unmistakable. The war had ended on paper, but technologically, it had merely changed continents. The rocket that once terrorized London was now the test article for a nation preparing to look upward, instead of outward, and history would soon disguise its origin. In the official American memory, the space age would one day be born at Cape Canaveral, not in a hidden German tunnel carved by forced labor beneath the Harz Mountains. But the engineers knew. The intelligence officers knew. The Pentagon knew. The future had not been invented in America. It had been captured, crated, shipped across an ocean, and quietly naturalized. And from the moment the first V-2 exhaust plumes scorched the New Mexico desert, one truth became permanent. The next war would not be decided by territory. It would be decided by altitude. Within a decade, the V-2 would become Redstone. Redstone would become Jupiter. Jupiter would become Saturn, and Saturn would carry mankind into orbit and beyond. Not because America pioneered the first step, but because it refused to let someone else finish it. The Allies had defeated Hitler's army, but they inherited his trajectory. The V-2 was more than a weapon. It was a warning label from the future. Whichever nation mastered the sky would one day master the world beneath it. And the United States had just placed its bet, not on conquest, but on ascendancy, because after 1945, the battlefield was no longer Europe. The battlefield was gravity itself, and the race to escape it had only just begun.